I've been asked to talk a little bit about why we should care about child poverty, about the child poverty rate. In doing so, I want to talk a bit about what we know about the relationships between child poverty and other negative child outcomes. Before I do so, let me give you 8 words that will tell you everything you need to know about this topic. Child Trends and National Center for Children in Poverty. Those 2 sources really are invaluable. Those are the go-to sources, Child Trends and National Center for Children in Poverty. The brochure that I have as a handout here is a really good resource, and read it and reread it. It'll tell you what you need to know. I should also mention that there's great user-friendly data on state poverty rates with all sorts of trend lines and nifty breakouts at Kids Count. The Kids Count website is a real good resource if you want state data and you want to play around with it. It's very user-friendly. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, which is another website that has a lot of breaking news on poverty. That's at spotlightonpoverty.org. Let me lay out a few data about child poverty. First, the overall child poverty rate is up from the previous year. For children, the poverty rate increased from 17.4% in 2006 to 18% in 2007. There are currently 13.3 million children in poverty in the United States. By contrast, the overall poverty rate remains statistically unchanged. That child rate is a big jump. That's a big jump for 1 year. Over the longer term, child poverty rate trends show only modest progress with periods of improvement followed by downturns. Most notably, the dramatic decline in the rate of child poverty in the late 1990s reversed in 2001 and has climbed significantly since. At least 1.5 million more children are now living in poverty than in the year 2000. We're at the highest rate since 1998. Perhaps more disturbing, the decade of improvement in the number of children living in deep poverty, meaning below half the poverty line, has also ended. Back in 1992, the rate of children in deep poverty hit an all-time high of 10.4%. That's half the poverty rate, and it was at 10.4%. By the year 2000, it had been cut by over a third to just 6.4%. The latest figures show that we're back at 8%, a bit less than 6 million kids who are living in poverty today. Despite progress, racial and ethnic disparities persist. In 2007, Black and Hispanic children were more than twice as likely to live in poverty as non-Hispanic, white, and Asian children. Family structure continues to be related to whether or not children are poor. Children living in households headed by single parents are more than 5 times as likely as kids living in households headed by married parents to be living in poverty. Finally, having immigrant parents increases a child's chances of being poor. Those are the basic facts. I want to outline and highlight 2 important facts about the relationships between child poverty and other child outcomes. First, not all poverty is created equal. Different types of poverty have different consequences for kids. Second, correlations, even strong ones, do not necessarily mean causality. Okay, there's poverty and there's poverty. Everyone agrees that poverty isn't good for kids, but it's important to stress that all types of poverty are not equally bad. Most notably, the evidence shows that transitory or temporary poverty is less harmful for kids than persistent or deep poverty. We can all think of circumstances where a family can be in poverty for a while and not have as harmful effects, lasting effects on the kids. For instance, many strong working class families temporarily slip below the poverty line for a while when one parent loses a job. The family may experience real economic hardship, but the kids will often bounce back provided there's a good, strong social safety net, food stamps, S-chip, unemployment insurance that works for their family. That's not to say that brief poverty is never harmful, but rather that deep and persistent poverty is more harmful to children than transitory poverty. Ideally, of course, children would be protected by both transitory and deep persistent poverty. Consequently, key distinctions that we need to think about are the timing, duration, and intensity of poverty in childhood. Deep or extreme poverty hurts. Persistent, sustained, or intergenerational poverty hurts a lot. And poverty during the early years of a child's life has lasting bad effects. Turning to the association and correlation and causality, we know a great deal about the outcomes associated with poverty. What's less often clear is whether it's poverty itself that's causing those other outcomes. In other words, the correlation between child and poverty and negative outcomes is often strikingly clear. Causality, not nearly so much. Let's talk about some specific outcomes. Let's talk about some outcomes that we care about for kids. Poverty is associated with poor child cognitive and educational outcomes. More importantly, deep, persistent, and early poverty are all important factors for cognitive and educational outcomes. Poverty is also associated with poor social and emotional outcomes, and the length of time in poverty heightens children's antisocial behaviors. Children who experience persistent poverty are more likely to have poor economic outcomes as adults. Finally, poverty also undermines children's health and safety outcomes. In short, effects of poverty on children's health and development depends on the timing, duration, and intensity of poverty in childhood. The risks are greatest for children who experience poverty when they're young, persistent and deep poverty, or other risks in addition to poverty. Okay, I hope I've convinced you that child poverty is associated with lots of crappy outcomes for kids. But to what extent is it poverty that causes those outcomes? That's a hugely important question and not one that's easy to answer. Poor families typically face a lot of other problems and challenges, all of which can hurt kids. It's not easy to disentangle which contribute the most to the bad child outcomes we care about. It could be the bad neighborhoods that poor kids typically live in. It could be their failing schools. Maybe it's their parents' educational level, or it could be their parents' parenting styles and family dynamics, or, as Ron suggests, most notably family structure. Poor kids often have only one parent in the home. We know that family structure counts, I agree with Ron, and counts a lot for both child poverty as well as negative outcomes, other negative outcomes. Once you control for family structure and these other variables, how much of poverty's association with bad outcomes remains? The short answer is that these other factors, especially family structure, do matter a lot. Once you control for them, however, once you control for all these other social and economic and status and parental advantages, poverty, especially persistent, deep, and early poverty, still matter for children a lot. The evidence is overwhelming that when families are entrapped in persistent poverty, childhood problems multiply. 90% of the families who end up losing their kids to foster care are poor. Poor kids are 5 times more likely to miss learning proficiency benchmarks than kids from families with greater economic security. Kids growing up in poor families are far more likely to drop out of school, get pregnant, or get in trouble with the law. There's every reason to worry that persistent, sustained family poverty that triggers these problems will grow, especially as Ron talked about, we're swimming against the tide. This kind of persistent poverty is a serious drag on the American competitiveness and influence in the world. Economists estimate that child poverty costs the nation about $500 billion a year. That burden will worsen in time if Ron's right. This nation, a dramatically aging one, cannot afford to have as much of a fifth of its children grow up without the financial stability, opportunities, supports, and connections needed to participate in the nation's economy. That's why we at the Casey Foundation argue so strongly for a 2-generation approach to child poverty. In order to truly improve the lives of children, poverty reduction efforts must take a 2-generational approach. We know that parents matter and their economic prospects directly and significantly affect the life circumstances of kids. We also know that working with parents is not enough. You can't just improve their income. We must target investments to programs and policies aimed at improving children's developmental outcomes and to break the cycle of